This is the second lecture for week 11, continuing the discussion of psychosocial development in middle adulthood, now talking about the social context of employment. I should say, too, that what we'll talk about goes beyond just middle adulthood. It really starts earlier in life in terms of when people start thinking about their occupations, so we'll start our discussion there. But in this lecture, we'll talk about employment as a social context, establishing a career, considerations in choosing a career, including personality, occupation and gender, work-life balance, and then aging at work and retirement. And there's some content in this lecture from week 5 and week 9 where these themes are explored in your reader. So the Bronfenbrenner ecological model, hopefully you recall from week 3, is a model that looks at different contexts that people experience in their lives over their lifespan. And I just wanted to point out that a person's work in which they directly participate is a microsystem. So again, those are those close settings that people participate in directly, such as home, school, community, and then as people get older, then work. It becomes added as an important context. But for children, their parents' work is an exosystem, which means exo meaning outside. So it's outside of their direct experience, but parents' work impacts children in terms of their microsystem. So their children are influenced by their parents' work in terms of their socioeconomic status, in terms of opportunities that they get, in terms of their parents' time and the amount of stress their parents experience. So that'll come up a little bit in this lecture around the idea of work-life balance. I also wanted to mention that there are a lot of different terms that are applied to the idea of a person's work or employment. So we use words like vocation, occupation, profession, career, and each of these words has subtly different meanings, even though they all relate to the idea of employment. First of all, a vocation was used as drawn from the Latin root. It means calling, and it was typically used in terms of having a religious calling. So people who were called to join the priesthood or become a nun, for example, were said to have a vocation. But it's used much more broadly today. But it still has a kind of sense about it of the kind of job that really calls to someone where they're a good fit and that's the right fit for who they are. Occupation, on the other hand, it has a root that's similar to occupy. So it's about taking time in a sense, so taking time, taking space. It's the way you spend your time is the kind of meaning of occupation. Profession has a sense of it in terms of the kind of employment that requires people to invest heavily in terms of school. So we refer to occupations as professions when they require some kind of credential, like being a doctor or a lawyer, a social worker, certain established professions that have the expectation of having gone to school. And then career is the path that one has in terms of their work life, the different experiences they have in terms of their working life. So those different terms will be kind of mixed into this lecture, and in terms of discussion of human development and people's work. So in terms of thinking about establishing a career and how that happens, it's really something you can think about with a lifespan perspective, that it's really something that happens starting in adolescence, which is the transition to adulthood, the time between childhood and adulthood. And then it continues through adulthood, and different people experience different phases. But as we'll talk about more in a minute, there's also a sense of continuity and change where it's not like you just go through a progression of stages one time. People may often kind of revisit their careers and make different choices, and so they may repeat or go through these stages again. So you're reading in chapter 5 and then chapter 9, they talk about two different perspectives on establishing a career. One is drawn from a longitudinal study and one is a theory. But really they both emphasize similar types of themes at similar times in the lifespan. So from adolescence to early young adulthood is really a time of exploration of different possibilities, and thinking about one's talents and interests and how they would relate to different possibilities. So the theory that comes from Super, the theory of vocational choice, which is described in chapter 9, talks about crystallization, and that's the idea of a person thinking about their talents and their interests and using those to shape their career ideas. But really, again, it's this time of exploration of different possibilities, and thinking about what one's going to do, and often people will be in school during this time. And then in early young adulthood, that would be for people who go to university and are, have done that right coming out of high school, will be after graduation from university. And it's a time when people are beginning to make tentative or trial commitments to a career. And they can even include the period of university. So Super's theory talks about specification, and that's the idea of learning about career matches, and how it matches with one personality, and then becoming more specific in terms of what one will do. So it's a time when people may try on different careers or different occupations, things that they might want to do, explore them by doing an internship, for example, starting a job, and may find that they like what they're doing, or may find this is not what I want to do. So someone might think they want to be in a classroom and they realize that their personality isn't a good fit for teaching, or they find that it's exactly what they want to do and it's a kind of vocation or calling. So that can happen, various things can happen in this stage of exploration, but it's getting more serious where people are narrowing down their choices. And then in later young adulthood, there's tend to be this stabilization of choice and implementation where people are entering the workforce and they're beginning to invest in a specific career path, and learning what it means to have a job, the responsibility of being in a job, how they have to adjust in terms of their lifestyle, the different behaviors that are required in terms of cooperation and productivity. And again, these different stages, people can go through them at later times too. So someone may decide that they want to change their career, and then they may go back to looking at their interests and their talents, about what they might want to do, trying different things, coming back to university at a later age, and then reestablishing a career, and re-entering a new profession. So that's this idea of continuity and change, which is one of the themes of human development over the lifespan, which is something we discussed in week 1. So when considering a possible career, people think about different things. So there are realities like the job market and how much a position would pay, what is required in terms of the physical and intellectual requirements of a position, the amount of education that's required. Does it require an undergraduate degree, some graduate work, a PhD, other types of higher education, and also work conditions. So how many hours will someone be expected to work? What is a work condition like? It's very different to work in a mine versus a office environment. And often when people are thinking about careers, if you think about it in a lifespan perspective, people will become more realistic over time. So if you think of a young child, if you ask a young child what they want to be, they'll often talk about glamorous professions like being an astronaut. But as young people, as they become a bit older and into adolescence, they can consider things like the realities of the job market for astronauts, where there are not very many jobs, the physical and intellectual requirements, where that's a highly demanding position, both in terms of intellect and physical requirements, and not many people will make the cut. It requires a high level of education and requires that you be available to shoot off to outer space. So, that's a kind of an ideal position where people become more realistic and they think, well, actually, maybe I'll look around this area, what kinds of jobs are available, and think more about my own personality and my aptitudes. Personality type theory suggests that people find work fulfilling when the important features of a job or profession fit the worker's personality. So Holland, who's a scholar, not the country, identified 6 different work-related personality types, including artistic, realistic, social, conventional, and suggested that each personality type is uniquely suited to different jobs. So, for example, someone who's realistic and enjoys physical labor, working with their hands, likes to solve concrete problems, may be drawn to jobs like being a mechanic or a truck driver. Whereas someone who's social and is skilled verbally and interpersonally, enjoys solving problems using those skills, may be drawn to becoming a teacher, a counselor, a social worker. So again, the idea is that when a vocation fits a person's personality, then he or she has a greater likelihood towards having a productive and stable career in that profession, because there's a good fit between the person and the career path that they've chosen. Another consideration, and sometimes it's not one that is conscious, but is the way that gender influences how people think about possible occupations. So the social role hypothesis is the idea that men and women typically take different roles within a society, and these are due to the expectation that society puts on them, including gender stereotypes, and that because people internalize these gender stereotypes, then they continue to act them out in their own experiences, and reinforce and maintain gender stereotypes. So, for example, men and women often traditionally have gone into some different kinds of professions. We often think of teaching and nursing and even social work as more sort of female professions, and other things like construction and mining and business as being more masculine types of professions. But of course, that's changing quite a bit. And it's also the idea that the way that people have internalized these types of stereotypes. So within occupations, women often have a lower status. Men are more likely to be in managerial roles. Women may defer to men. And so, it's this idea of recapitulating stereotypes that are part of our society. A related idea, and maybe also the flip side of the idea of social role hypothesis, is that gender also has a very real impact on people's lives and their work lives. So women are often have different career trajectories. They're more likely to take time out of the workplace when they have a baby and to care for young children, and when they're older, to care for aging parents as well, as we'll talk about in the third lecture this week. So there is this difference in terms of how women combine life and work, and the idea of work-life balance. But work-life balance is also important for men. So, when researchers are beginning to increasingly look at this issue of work-life balance, men also talk about how they want to be able to take an active role in their families' lives and be hands-on fathers. So work-life balance is a dynamic for anybody in terms of their working life who plan on combining having a family with work. So looking at aging and middle adulthood and people's work lives, middle adulthood is often a time where there's a lot of focus on career and there's a lot of achievement. So it's often a time of peak career performance during the middle adulthood years, particularly as things have changed in society, and emerging adulthood means that people often don't start careers until later 20s, early 30s. The 40s, 50s, and 60s are often a time when people are achieving a lot in their careers and taking on higher positions. So according to studies on aging workers, of which there have been many, and meta-analyses that have looked across studies and reanalyzed the data, there doesn't seem to be a big difference in terms of younger and older workers in terms of job performance. Older workers continue to be showing the same kind of level of creativity and quality in their work. They may be at a slight disadvantage in terms of things like computers, because that's been more the experience of the millennial generation compared to the baby boomer generation and Generation X. But the reading also talks about, as people age, they also learn, they know themselves better in middle adulthood, and they find ways to cope with aging. So it describes in your reader on page 199 how people cope with aging using a SOC strategy. So selection, for example, people may start to focus more on the kinds of things they want to do in their career, maybe more selective about the kinds of tasks they take on, can get better around delegating to others. Optimization, where they're really focusing on areas of specialization and keeping up to date in those areas. And then compensation, so when they know they have some kind of a weakness, like around memory, for example, learning tricks to get around those challenges. And then finally, in terms of the arc of someone's professional life, there is the phase of moving into retirement. And your reading talks about how really it's a fairly recent advent in terms of the way we think about human development, just like emerging adulthood is fairly recent because of changes to the economy and in part due to affluence, that people have resources to study for longer and travel, things like that. Same with retirement. So there was a time that basically people would work as long as they could, and that continues to be true for many non-industrialized countries, developing countries. But us, workers in Australia and other developed countries, first world countries, can expect and plan typically to move into retirement. And retirement brings its own challenges, even though people often will look forward to it over their work lives. There is adjusting to the loss of the role of worker. So that's often a way that people really define themselves and their identity. So it's about constructing a new identity and determining what will fill one's time when occupation, the thing that took your time before, is gone. So finding new and satisfying, meaningful lifestyles. And the research suggests that adjustment to retirement is better when people have a high sense of personal control, so they feel in control of their lives. They have good physical health, and they have some measure of financial security. And just for those of you stalwarts who are still doing the lectures, I'm just going to tell you that this is a question on the final. So congratulations for watching the lectures. Remember this one. So all three of these factors are important in terms of adjustment to retirement. Okay, now we're going to move over and talk about changes to relationships in middle adulthood and particularly in relation to the family life cycle model.